The woman fed a homeless boy, not knowing that 16 years later, he would become the most dangerous mafia boss in Chicago, and that single decision would change her life forever. Steam rose slowly from the grill, mixing with the smell of sizzling hot dogs and toasted buns. Mrs. Clara Bennett's cart was humble but spotless. An old metal stand, a faded canopy patched in 3 places, a hissing grill, and jars of ketchup and mustard lined up like little soldiers. All around was the noise of South Side Chicago, car horns blaring, hurried footsteps on cracked sidewalks, a distant siren wailing, and voices crossing paths without making eye contact. Mrs. Clara had working hands with tiny burn scars and tired nails, hands that had once held her husband's badge and her son's baby photos, now holding nothing but a greasy spatula. She adjusted her stained apron and served a portion to a regular customer who had known her for years. It was close to 6 in the evening when the sun began to dip behind the worn buildings, and the canopy shadow stretched longer across the pavement. That was when she saw him. A boy. He was not running like other children. He was not making noise. He stood perfectly still, watching her from a distance, like a wounded animal deciding whether to trust or to flee. He looked about 12 years old, but his eyes told a different story. Gray eyes, gray like a winter storm, too old, too sharp, too knowing for a child his age. High cheekbones jutted beneath hollow cheeks. Black hair fell messily across his forehead. His clothes were torn, too big, hanging off his thin frame like borrowed skin. His sneakers had lost their shape long ago. He had no backpack. He had no adult. He had only hunger. And something else. Something dark and patient burning quietly behind those storm-gray eyes. If this story touches your heart, hit the like button to share the love. Share this video with someone who believes in second chances. And subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story that matters. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness plants a seed that grows into something the world never saw coming. Mrs. Clara didn't make a scene, didn't clutch her chest in lament, didn't cry out a single sound. She simply looked at the boy the way one looks at something that hurts because it's too real to deny. The boy stood a few meters from the cart, not daring to come any closer, as if an invisible wall were holding him back. Then he began to walk, slowly, one step at a time, his torn shoes dragging along the pavement as though he were moving across thin ice and feared it might crack at any moment. When he stopped in front of Mrs. Clara, he didn't lift his head right away. He looked down at the ground first, then slowly raised his eyes. And when those storm-gray eyes met hers, something passed between them, an understanding that didn't need words. The boy opened his mouth, his voice rough from not being used for a long time, and asked politely whether she had any leftover food she couldn't sell. Mrs. Clara held the tongs suspended in midair. She'd heard that question many times from other children over the years, but there was something different about this boy. He wasn't begging with calculation, didn't carry the slyness of street children who'd learned to deceive in order to survive. He asked in shame, a deep, piercing shame, as if having to ask for food hurt more than the hunger gnawing at his stomach. Mrs. Clara lowered the tongs and asked if he had a mother, her voice neither accusing nor pitying, just a simple question. The boy looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing whether he should tell the truth, then slowly shook his head and said, "No, his mother was dead. He had no one." His voice didn't tremble, didn't break. It was flat in a way that was frightening, as if he'd said those words so many times they no longer hurt, or as if he'd learned to bury the pain so deep no one could see it. Mrs. Clara swallowed hard. She looked at the pot of soup, at the loaves of bread still warm, at the nearly empty cash box, then back at the boy. She took a deep breath and made a decision she didn't know would change the rest of her life. She told him to come closer. Come on. She wasn't going to bite. The boy stepped forward, cautiously, each movement measured as if he were waiting for a trap to snap shut. Mrs. Clara took a clean plate, not leftovers, not scraps, but a full portion with hot, crusty bread, sausages still sizzling from the grill, ketchup and mustard gleaming. She set the plate in front of him and said simply, "Eat." The boy stared at the food, then at Mrs. Clara, then back at the food, as if he couldn't trust his own eyes. He sat down on the plastic chair beside the cart, his hands trembling as he picked up the bread. He ate fast at first, rushed and almost choking, as if someone might snatch the food away at any second. Then he slowed, one bite at a time, as if his body was finally realizing this wasn't a dream, that there would be food in his stomach, that he didn't have to swallow like a wild animal. Mrs. Clara stood watching him eat and felt a tightness in her chest she couldn't explain. Maybe it was the memory of her son, of James, of the days when he was small and she cooked for him in a warm kitchen. Maybe it was exhaustion after so many years of surviving alone. Or maybe it was the bitter knowledge that no one should ever have to watch a child eat as if this were his last chance. She took a napkin and handed it to the boy, her voice gentle but not falsely sweet, telling him to wipe his mouth. The boy looked up at her, and for the first time, those storm-gray eyes held something else. Not wariness, not wildness, but a small, fragile spark of hope clinging to life. He whispered, "Thank you," his voice on the verge of breaking. "Mrs." Clara nodded, looking at his small hands, the scraped knuckles, the broken, dirty nails, the fingers slightly swollen from cold and from sleeping without warmth. She asked him his name, forcing her voice to stay steady. The boy swallowed the last bite, looked straight into her eyes, and answered that his name was Daniel. "Mrs." Clara was just about to ask Daniel more when a voice rose from behind her, cold as stone and thick with contempt. "Mrs. Bennett, feeding stray dogs again. Are you?" "Mrs." Clara turned around and felt her entire body stiffen when she saw Victor Malone approaching with 2 of his men behind him. Victor was the kind of man everyone in the South Side knew and feared. A loan shark and protection boss who had ruled these streets for 20 years. He was fat and bald, his face flushed from alcohol, wearing a cheap leather jacket yet moving as if he owned the entire neighborhood. Victor stopped in front of the cart, his eyes flicking over Daniel with the disgust one might give a sewer rat. Then he looked back at Mrs. Clara and sneered. He asked how many more street kids she planned to feed when she still had not paid all of this month's protection money. "Mrs." Clara straightened her back even though her spine ached, looked him directly in the eyes, and said this was her business and she would pay the rest by the weekend. Victor stepped closer, the stench of cheap whiskey hitting her nose, his voice dropping into a dangerous hiss as he reminded her that she had no one protecting her anymore. Thomas was dead, and she knew what happened to people who didn't listen to him. "Mrs." Clara felt as if a knife had been driven into her chest when her husband's name was spoken by that filthy mouth. Thomas, her husband, the honest police officer who had died 10 years ago in an accident she had always known was no accident. She wanted to scream, wanted to grab Victor by the collar and demand what he knew about Thomas's death, but she couldn't. She was too weak, too old, and she knew that if she spoke, no one would believe her. Victor saw the pain on her face and laughed louder, slapped the side of the cart so hard the condiment bottles nearly toppled, and said that by this weekend, not a single day later, or he would show her what it meant to lose everything. He turned to leave with his men, but before walking away completely, he threw a glance at Daniel and added that, as for this kid, she'd better chase him off before Victor called the police about her sheltering a vagrant child, and then this filthy cart would disappear too. Their laughter echoed down the street as they left, leaving Mrs. Clara standing there with trembling hands and a heart racing out of control. She tried to hide her fear, tried to keep her face calm, but her shoulders were shaking in waves. She turned back to Daniel, intending to apologize for what he had just witnessed, but the words caught in her throat when she saw his eyes. Daniel was staring in the direction Victor had gone, and that look was not the look of a frightened 12-year-old. It was the gaze of a beast memorizing the scent of an enemy, cold, calculating, and terrifyingly patient. The boy had observed everything, every word, every gesture, every triumphant expression on Victor's face, and he was engraving it all into his memory as if writing a ledger of debts he intended to collect one day, line by line. A chill ran down Mrs. Clara's spine, not because she was afraid of the boy, but because she suddenly realized the child standing before her was unlike any she had ever known. Then Daniel turned back to her, and in an instant, those storm-gray eyes softened, returning to the eyes of a hungry and lonely boy. He asked her quietly who that man was. "Mrs." Clara sighed, bone deep with exhaustion, and answered that he was Victor Malone, the kind of man a child should stay far away from. Daniel said nothing more. He only nodded slowly. But Mrs. Clara didn't know that the name had already been carved deep into the boy's mind, and 16 years later, Victor Malone would pay for every word he had spoken that afternoon. Dusk settled in, and the Chicago wind grew colder as Mrs. Clara packed up the cart. She looked at Daniel, still sitting on the plastic chair, hunched inside his thin, torn jacket, and she knew she couldn't let the boy leave like this. She asked where he planned to sleep tonight, her voice trying to sound ordinary, as if it were nothing more than polite conversation. Daniel looked down and said he would find a place. He always found a place. Mrs. Clara knew what that meant. Under bridges, in alley corners, in places where a Chicago winter night could quietly steal a child's life without anyone ever knowing. She sighed and told him he was coming home with her tonight, and they would figure things out tomorrow. Daniel looked up at her with suspicion, as if waiting for the condition attached, waiting for the price, because the streets had taught him that nothing was ever given for free. But Mrs. Clara said nothing more. She simply pushed the cart and motioned for him to follow. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of an aging building, the wooden stairs creaking under every step, the walls stained with old watermarks and the faint smell of dampness hanging in the air. When she opened the door, Daniel stepped inside and froze at the threshold, his gray eyes sweeping the small space as if assessing possible escape routes. The apartment had 1 bedroom, a combined living room and kitchen, and a tiny bathroom, but everything was clean and carefully kept down to the smallest detail. Mrs. Clara pointed to the bathroom and told him to take a shower. She would find clean clothes for him. Daniel went in without a word, and a few minutes later she heard the water running. She went into the bedroom, opened the old wardrobe, and took out a set of clothes that had belonged to James, her son, from when he was about 12 or 13. She had kept them all these years, unable to throw them away, as if holding on to them meant holding on to a part of her child. When Daniel came out of the bathroom, Mrs. Clara nearly cried. He looked completely different with the grime washed away, his face sharp and striking in a way unusual for a child, and those gray eyes shining like stones in the dark. She handed him the clothes and told him to put them on and come out to eat more. Daniel dressed without asking whose clothes they were, but when he stepped into the living room, he stopped in front of the wall where 2 framed photographs hung. One showed a man in a police uniform, smiling gently, warmth in his eyes. The other showed a boy of about 16, grinning beside a birthday cake. Daniel looked at the photos for a long moment, then asked who they were. Mrs. Clara was carrying a bowl of soup from the kitchen. She paused for a beat at the question, then set the bowl on the table and answered in a calm voice that concealed her pain that they were her husband and her son, Thomas and James. Her husband had died 10 years ago, and her son had left and never come back. Daniel didn't ask anything more. He understood the silence that followed those words. He understood there were wounds that shouldn't be touched. He sat down and ate the hot soup Mrs. Clara had made, beef soup with potatoes and carrots, the kind she used to cook for James every winter night. Mrs. Clara sat across from him, watching him eat, and felt her heart breaking apart piece by piece. This boy wasn't her son, wasn't James, but the way he sat there, the way he held the spoon, the way he occasionally looked up at her as if to make sure she was still there, pulled her back to distant days when this kitchen had once been filled with laughter. When he finished eating, Mrs. Clara took out an old blanket, the one James had used as a child, spread it over the sofa, and told Daniel he would sleep there tonight. Daniel lay down, pulled the blanket up to his chest, and for the first time in many years, felt the warmth of a real home. He didn't say thank you out loud, but when Mrs. Clara turned off the light and walked into her bedroom, he whispered into the darkness, wishing her good night. Mrs. Clara stopped at her doorway, tears streaming down her face, and whispered back, wishing him good night, then closed the door and let the tears fall in silence. The days that followed passed like a dream. Neither Mrs. Clara nor Daniel dared believe was real. The next morning, when Mrs. Clara woke up, she found that Daniel had already risen, folding the blanket neatly and placing it carefully on the sofa as if he had never slept there at all. She asked if he wanted to go with her to the cart, and he nodded without a word. From then on, every day Daniel followed Mrs. Clara to the street corner, helping her push the cart, arrange the ingredients, wipe down the tables and chairs, and carry food to customers. He didn't talk much, but he worked hard with the astonishing focus of someone long accustomed to surviving by his own hands. Mrs. Clara's regular customers began to notice the boy. Some asked if he was her grandson, and Mrs. Clara only smiled without answering, because she herself didn't know what to call what they were to each other. In the evenings, when they returned to the apartment, Mrs. Clara began teaching Daniel how to cook. She showed him how to marinate meat, how to toast bread until it was crisp without burning, how to mix the secret sauce she had been making for decades. Daniel learned quickly, his hands moving with ease as if he had been born for this work, and Mrs. Clara realized he was far more intelligent than his ragged appearance suggested. One afternoon, while Daniel was changing his shirt in the bathroom with the door slightly open, Mrs. Clara accidentally saw his back. She froze at the doorway, her hands trembling as she held a stack of clean clothes. The boy's back was covered in scars, long marks like lashings, round burns like cigarette stubs, raised and uneven patches as if he had been beaten so many times the skin could no longer heal properly. It was a map of the hell he had walked through, proof of years spent in a brutal foster care system and on merciless streets. Mrs. Clara stepped back before Daniel could see her, went into the kitchen, and cried in silence. One hand clamped over her mouth to keep from making a sound. She didn't ask Daniel about the scars. She knew there were pains that shouldn't be touched by words, only healed by time and care. From that night on, she cooked more for him, held him longer whenever she wished him good night, and looked at him with the eyes of a mother trying to make up for everything this child had never been given. Daniel felt the change. And though he didn't say it aloud, he began calling her Grandma C, instead of addressing her without a name as before. Their bond formed naturally, without definitions or titles. Just two lonely people finding each other in a cold city. But happiness on the South Side was never allowed to last. One afternoon, while Daniel was helping Mrs. Clara clean up, Helen Rodriguez, the Latina woman who lived in the apartment across the hall, rushed over with worry written all over her face. Helen was a widow raising 3 children on her own, the only friend Mrs. Clara had in that building, and she had always cared for Mrs. Clara like a sister. Helen pulled her aside and whispered that Victor Malone was asking around about the child she was sheltering, asking where the boy came from, whether he had papers, whether there was any legal guardian. Helen held Mrs. Clara's hand and warned her to be careful. Victor was the kind of man who stopped at nothing. He had ruined so many lives in the neighborhood, and she shouldn't give him an excuse to come after her. Mrs. Clara looked toward Daniel, who was wiping a table with a calm expression, but she knew he had heard everything because his shoulders stiffened slightly. She thanked Helen and said she would be careful, but in her heart she knew the storm was coming, and there was no way to stop it. That night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, Mrs. Clara wondered whether she was being selfish by keeping Daniel there, whether she was putting him in danger simply because she was lonely and needed someone to love. But then she remembered the way Daniel looked at her, the sound of him calling her Grandma C, the way he smiled when he learned a new recipe, and she knew she couldn't let him go. No matter what happened, she would protect this boy, she told herself before drifting into an uneasy sleep. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, when Mrs. Clara and Daniel were busy serving customers as they always were. Mrs. Clara didn't notice the police car parked at the corner of the street, nor did she see the white van from Child Protective Services stopping just behind it. She only sensed something was wrong when a man in a brown leather jacket walked up with 2 uniformed officers, followed by Victor Malone wearing a triumphant smile he didn't bother to hide. The man in the leather jacket held up his badge and said he was Detective Frank Morrison from the Chicago Police Department, and the other 2 were from Child Protective Services. They had received a report that she was harboring a runaway minor without legal guardianship. Mrs. Clara felt the blood rush to her head. She stepped in front of Daniel as if to shield him, and said the boy had no one. She was only helping him. And what was wrong with helping a hungry child? Detective Morrison looked at her with cold eyes, without a trace of sympathy, and replied that the law was the law. She had no guardianship papers, no adoption application, and she was violating child protection regulations. The boy needed to be taken to an approved facility. A female child services worker stepped closer to Daniel, her voice sickeningly sweet as she told him not to be afraid. They were taking him somewhere safe, where he would have a place to stay, food to eat, and people to care for him. Daniel didn't move. He stood still like stone, gray eyes fixed on Victor, who was smiling behind them. He didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't beg. He simply stood there with the terrifying calm of someone who was already far too familiar with betrayal. Mrs. Clara rushed forward and grabbed Detective Morrison's arm, begging him not to take the boy, saying she would do the paperwork. She would apply for guardianship. She would do everything by the book. Just give her time. Morrison shook her off and said there were no exceptions. Procedure was procedure. She could go to Child Services later to file an application, but today the boy had to go. The 2 workers stepped in, one of them placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder, and the boy let himself be led away without resistance. Mrs. Clara ran after them, tears pouring down her wrinkled face, shouting that Daniel, she would find him. She promised she would find him, and to wait for her. Daniel turned and looked at her through the van window, and for a brief moment those gray eyes softened. He gave a small nod, as if telling her he believed her, that he would wait. Then the door slammed shut, and the van drove away, carrying the boy Mrs. Clara had begun to love as her own. Mrs. Clara collapsed onto the sidewalk, her knees striking the concrete with a sharp pain she didn't feel, because the agony in her chest was 1,000 times worse. She had lost Thomas, she had lost James, and now she had lost Daniel too, as if life kept tearing away everything she ever loved. Victor's laughter rang out behind her, cold and cruel. He stepped in front of her and said she saw now, didn't she? He had warned her, not to meddle in things that weren't hers, not to play the hero when she was nobody. Mrs. Clara looked up at Victor with tear-filled eyes, and for the first time in her life, she saw pure evil clearly reflected in his gaze. He hadn't done this for the law, not because he cared about Daniel. He had done it because he enjoyed watching her suffer, because he wanted her to know he could destroy anything she cherished. Victor bent down and whispered in her ear that next week's protection money would be doubled, a fee for handling the trouble, and if she didn't pay in full, he would show her what losing everything really meant. Then he walked away, his footsteps echoing on the pavement like the knocking of fate. Helen ran out from the small crowd that had gathered, wrapped her arms around Clara, and helped her up, apologizing over and over and saying she had tried to stop it but couldn't in time. Mrs. Clara didn't hear her. She only stared in the direction the van had vanished, her heart shattered into a million pieces. She promised herself that no matter how long it took, no matter what she had to do, she would find Daniel again. But she didn't know that the child protection system wouldn't give her any information, that her guardianship application would be rejected because she was too poor and too old, that Daniel would be sent to a harsh detention facility and disappear from the system when he turned 18. She didn't know that she would spend the next 16 years searching in vain, crying every night beside the blanket he once slept under, looking at homeless children and wondering if Daniel was still alive. And she didn't know that not far away, inside the moving van, Daniel was staring out the window with gray eyes cold as ice, carving a silent vow into his heart that one day he would return, and those who had caused suffering to Grandma C would pay the price. 16 years passed like a long, unending nightmare. 16 brutal Chicago winters, 16 times. Mrs. Clara stood at the old street corner watching children walk by and wondering whether Daniel was still alive. Mrs. Clara was now 58 years old. The black hair she once had was white as snow, pinned neatly at the nape of her neck with an old clip. Her back was more bent than before, every step heavy as if she were carrying the whole world on her shoulders, and the eyes that had once been warm and bright were now dimmed by too many nights of silent tears. Her cart was still at the same corner, the same rusted metal frame, the same patched awning with more repairs than before, the same grill sizzling every afternoon. She had fixed it countless times, replacing one part after another as they broke, because she didn't have the money for a new cart, and because she didn't want to leave this corner. This was where she had met Daniel, where the boy had once stood watching her from a distance with storm-gray eyes, and she was afraid that if she left, he wouldn't be able to find her if he ever came back. But he never did. Mrs. Clara had done everything she could to find Daniel in those first years. She went to Child Protective Services every week, filing guardianship applications, asking for information, begging to know where the boy was. They refused every request, saying she didn't meet the financial requirements, that she was too old, that she wasn't family, and therefore had no right to the information. She hired a cheap lawyer to help her sue, but the case dragged on for 2 years before being dismissed for lack of legal grounds. When Daniel turned 18 and left the system, she went back to the office one last time, and they only told her that he was now an adult and had left no contact information. That was the last time she ever heard anything about him. 16 years, and Victor Malone still came to collect protection money every month like a curse that had lasted 26 years. He had aged, grown fatter, his face redder from alcohol, but the cruelty in his eyes hadn't faded at all. He came on the first day of every month, took nearly half of what she earned, and every time he came, he reminded her of her place. He told her she was nobody, that Thomas was dead, that James had walked away, that even the kid she had taken in hadn't bothered to come back for her. Every word was a knife driven into her chest, but she didn't cry in front of him anymore. She had run out of tears long ago. Helen still lived in the apartment across the hall, still her only friend, still occasionally bringing over a bowl of hot soup and sitting with her so she wouldn't feel so alone. Helen often urged her to leave, to move somewhere else, to start over in a place where Victor didn't exist. But Mrs. Clara couldn't go. She couldn't leave the street corner, couldn't leave the old apartment where the photographs of Thomas and James still hung on the wall, where the blanket Daniel had once slept under was still folded neatly in the corner of the closet. Every night before going to bed, Mrs. Clara opened the closet and touched that blanket, faded with time but kept clean as it had been from the beginning. She remembered the way Daniel had curled up inside it, remembered his eyes closing in peaceful sleep for the first time after so many years on the streets. She wondered where he was now, whether he was living well, whether he still remembered her, or whether she was just another stranger who had fed him a few meals and then disappeared from his memory like so many others. She didn't know that Daniel had never forgotten her, that he had changed completely, that he had become someone the entire Chicago underworld feared, and that with each passing day, he was drawing closer to a plan he had been carrying in his heart for 16 years. That afternoon arrived with a bad omen as the Chicago sky turned gray, and the wind cut colder than usual. Mrs. Clara was packing up her cart after a slow day of sales when Victor Malone appeared. But this time he didn't come with his 2 men like he usually did. He came alone, and that frightened her even more. When Victor came alone, it meant he had something personal to say. It meant the threats would be heavier than usual. Victor stopped in front of the cart, his eyes bloodshot from alcohol, looking at Mrs. Clara with undisguised contempt. He said things had changed, Mrs. Bennett. He was having a bit of trouble and needed cash fast, so starting this month the protection money would triple. Mrs. Clara felt her legs nearly give way. Triple meant almost everything she earned in a month. It meant no money for supplies, no money for rent, no money to survive. Her voice shook as she said she didn't have that much. She was just an old woman selling hot dogs. How could she possibly have that kind of money? Victor stepped closer, the smell of cheap whiskey and cigars flooding her nose, and he leaned in, whispering in a dangerous tone that it wasn't his problem. He needed the money and she would have it, and if she didn't, he would show her what it meant to disappear. Mrs. Clara looked up at him with eyes full of despair and asked what he wanted from her. She had paid him for 26 years. What did she have that made him cling to her like this? Victor laughed, his voice thick and cruel. Then he said something she had never imagined he would admit. He asked if she knew why he had followed her all these years, why he never left her alone. Because he was paid to do it. Because someone wanted him to keep an eye on her after Thomas died, and he had done his job well. Mrs. Clara felt as if a bucket of ice water had been poured over her. She asked in a trembling voice what he had just said. Thomas. What did he know about Thomas? Victor looked at her with the pleasure of a man torturing his prey. He said Thomas was a good cop. Too good. So good he wanted to expose an entire corruption ring inside the department. And people like that didn't live very long. He went on to say that everyone knew the accident wasn't an accident, but no one dared say it out loud. And he was the one paid to stay silent, and to make sure she stayed silent too. The world spun around Mrs. Clara. For years she had suspected. She had known Thomas's death wasn't simple, but hearing the enemy confess it with his own mouth was a blow to her chest that left her unable to breathe. She asked him, choking on her words, whether he had killed Thomas, whether he had personally killed her husband. Victor shook his head and said he hadn't pulled the trigger himself. He had only provided information, told people with more power where Thomas would be, which route he would take, whether he was alone or accompanied. What happened after that wasn't his concern. Mrs. Clara wanted to scream, wanted to attack him, wanted to call the police. But she knew the police in this neighborhood were either in Victor's pocket or in the pockets of those above him. All she could do was stand there, tears streaming down her wrinkled face, staring at her enemy with helpless eyes. Victor saw her cry and laughed again. He told her she should cry. Cry as much as she wanted, then bring him the money this weekend. And if she thought about going to the police or telling anyone what he had just said, he would send her to see Thomas sooner than planned. Then he walked away, leaving Mrs. Clara alone in a street sinking into darkness. People kept walking by. Cars kept passing. Life went on as if nothing had happened, because no one knew, no one cared, and no one would help a poor old woman being threatened in the open. Mrs. Clara packed up the cart with trembling hands, pushed it home with legs heavy as lead, and when she reached her apartment, she collapsed onto the floor and cried until there were no tears left. She looked up at Thomas's photograph on the wall and whispered apologies, apologizing that she couldn't do anything, apologizing that she was too weak, apologizing that she had lived without being able to demand justice for him. That night, for the first time in many years, Mrs. Clara felt true despair. She felt that maybe death would be gentler than the life crushing her shoulders, but she didn't know that at that very moment, not far away, a black car was idling in the shadows, and the man inside had heard every word Victor spoke, through a microphone attached to a streetlight, and that man was smiling. A smile cold as ice. 3 days after that fateful afternoon, Mrs. Clara was still standing at the old street corner, dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights, and a heart weighed down by dread. She didn't know what to do. Didn't know where she could possibly find the money Victor demanded. Didn't know where to run or who to beg for help. All she could do was stand there, grill hot dogs, serve the few customers who stopped by, and wait for fate to knock on her door. That afternoon dragged on slowly like every other afternoon, until a car appeared at the far end of the street. It wasn't the kind of car people usually saw on the south side. It wasn't an old sedan or a dusty pickup truck like the locals drove. It was a black Maybach, polished like a mirror, gliding slowly over the pothole-filled road without making a sound, like a predator entering its territory. Pedestrians stopped to stare. Housewives leaned out of their windows. Children froze mid-game, and the entire street seemed to hold its breath as the car stopped less than 10 meters from Mrs. Clara's cart. Mrs. Clara held the tongs in her hand, her heart pounding wildly, not knowing whether this was good or bad. In this neighborhood, luxury cars usually meant trouble, drug lords or loan sharks even more powerful than Victor. The front passenger door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, dark sunglasses despite the fading light. His face was cold as stone, his features sharp as if carved from steel, and the way he stood spoke of someone accustomed to violence, someone used to protecting others at any cost. He swept his gaze over the street, assessing every shadow, every window, every possible threat, then gave a subtle nod toward the car. The rear door opened, and another man stepped out. Mrs. Clara felt her breath catch in her throat when she saw him. He stood about 1.85 meters tall, his build solid as sculpted stone, dressed in an expensive charcoal gray three-piece suit the likes of which she had never seen anyone wear in her entire life. The watch on his wrist glinted under the streetlights, his black hair neatly cut and slicked back, and his face carried sharp, blade-like angles. But it wasn't the suit, not the watch, not the air of power that made Mrs. Clara freeze in place. It was the eyes, gray like a winter storm, gray like a distant day 16 years ago, when she had seen a boy standing a few meters from her cart, with hunger in his stomach and darkness in his soul. Those eyes had changed now, colder, sharper, more dangerous, but she recognized them all the same. She would have recognized them even after 1,000,000 years. A faint scar ran from his temple down to his left cheek, a scar that hadn't been there 16 years earlier, and Mrs. Clara wondered what that boy had endured to earn it. The man walked toward the cart, his steps confident and commanding, as if he were walking down a red carpet instead of the cracked pavement of the south side. The bodyguard followed a few steps behind, eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. The entire street kept watching, whispering, wondering who this man was and why he had come to this poor corner of the city. Mrs. Clara stood there, unable to move, still clutching the tongs like an old warrior holding her last weapon. The man stopped in front of the cart, storm-gray eyes locking onto hers, and for a brief moment, she saw them soften, just for an instant, like sunlight piercing dark clouds before vanishing. Mrs. Clara opened her mouth, but no sound came out, her heart racing, her mind spinning between hope and disbelief. She wanted to ask, wanted to know, wanted to be sure, but she was afraid that if she spoke, the dream would shatter. Afraid this was nothing more than an illusion conjured by a lonely old woman who had lost too much in her life. After studying her for a long moment, as if carving every wrinkle on her face into his memory, the man finally spoke in a low, warm voice, filled with authority, telling her to give him a full portion, not leftovers. Mrs. Clara felt as if someone had just poured a bucket of cold water over her and then scalding water right after. That sentence, every single word of it, was the exact sentence she had spoken to a boy 16 years earlier, when he stood in front of this cart with hunger in his eyes and shame in his heart. She had said it so he would know she wasn't giving him scraps like charity, but a full portion, the way a human being deserved to be treated. And now the man standing before her was repeating those words perfectly, like a code, like a key unlocking a door of memory that had been sealed for 16 years. The tongs slipped from Mrs. Clara's hand and fell onto the counter with a soft clink, but she didn't hear it. She heard nothing except her heart pounding wildly in her chest. She looked into those storm-gray eyes, at that sharply cut face, at the scar on the left cheek, and she saw it. She saw the 12-year-old boy from long ago hidden beneath the shell of the powerful man standing before her. She opened her mouth, her voice trembling so badly it barely formed sound, and asked, "My child, are you?" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't dare finish it, because she was afraid that if she said it out loud and the answer was no, she would die right there. The man looked at her, and in those ice-cold eyes, something melted. He spoke more softly, more gently, in a voice he hadn't used with anyone for 16 years, saying it had been a long time. "Grandma C. Far too long. Grandma C." Those two words struck Mrs. Clara's heart like a bullet, not to kill her, but to wake her, to pull her out of the 16-year nightmare. Only one person had ever called her that. Only one boy had begun calling her Grandma C during those brief days they had shared. Mrs. Clara felt her knees give way, but before she could fall, the man stepped forward and caught her, his hands strong yet unexpectedly gentle. She looked up at him, tears already streaming down her wrinkled face, and she whispered the name she had spoken in her dreams for 16 years, Daniel. The man nodded slowly, gray eyes never leaving hers, and said, "Yes, it's me. I'm home." Mrs. Clara cried, not loud sobs, but the silent crying of someone who had endured too much for too long. Tears poured out like a broken dam, carrying 16 years of waiting, 16 years of hope, 16 years of wondering whether he was alive or dead somewhere in the world. She lifted her hand and touched his face, touched the scar on his cheek, and asked through her tears where he had been, where he had gone all those years, that she had looked for him, searched everywhere and never found him. Daniel, or Roman as the name he used now, took her trembling hand and said he knew. He knew she had searched. He knew she had never given up, and that was why he had come back. Marcus Stone stood a few steps away, eyes still scanning the surroundings, but even his hardened face softened slightly at the sight before him. He had been Roman's right hand for many years, the only person who knew his past, about the old hot dog vendor his boss had watched over and protected from a distance for so long. People in the neighborhood watched from afar, whispering among themselves, not understanding what was happening, not understanding why a powerful kingpin was holding an elderly street vendor at a corner stall. Mrs. Clara didn't care about those looks. She only knew she was holding Daniel, holding him tightly, afraid that if she let go, he would disappear again like 16 years before. She kept saying over and over that he was home, that he was really home, thanking God for bringing him back to her. Daniel let her hold him, something he had not allowed anyone to do for 16 years. And in that moment, the most dangerous mafia boss in Chicago was gone, leaving only the 12-year-old boy who had once found again the arms of the woman who fed him when he was hungry, gave him a home when he had nowhere to go, and gave him love when the whole world turned its back on him. The reunion was cut short by a familiar voice echoing from the far end of the street, a voice Mrs. Clara had been forced to hear for over 2 decades, and had learned to fear down to her bones. "Mrs. Bennett, where's my money? Today's the deadline." Victor Malone was walking toward them with 2 of his men. He hadn't yet noticed the Maybach parked across the street because darkness was settling in, and he hadn't recognized the well-dressed man standing beside the cart. He only saw Mrs. Clara standing there, and he assumed this would be like every other afternoon, him coming to collect and watching the old woman tremble. Mrs. Clara felt her body go rigid at the sound of Victor's voice. She instinctively stepped back and clutched Daniel's sleeve. But Daniel didn't retreat. He slowly turned around, the movement controlled and deliberate, like a panther turning to face its prey. Victor came closer, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, and he noticed someone standing beside Mrs. Clara, a tall man dressed in luxury, though he still didn't recognize who it was. He sneered and said, "Oh, Mrs. Bennett has a distinguished guest," but guest or not, protection money was still due on time. Daniel stood motionless, storm-gray eyes fixed on Victor's face, and he didn't say a word. That silence carried weight, heavy and threatening enough that Victor began to sense something was wrong. He stepped closer, trying to appear calm, and asked who the man was, whether he knew whose territory this was, whether he knew who controlled this neighborhood. Daniel still didn't answer. He only tilted his head slightly. And that was the signal. Marcus Stone stepped out of the shadows behind the Maybach, followed by 4 other men, all wearing black suits, all built like men accustomed to violence. They moved fast and silently like ghosts, surrounding Victor and his 2 men within seconds before anyone could react. Victor looked around, panic beginning to surface in his eyes, realizing he was surrounded by men who weren't amateur street thugs like his own crew. These were professionals, men who had killed without reason and would kill him without hesitation if ordered. Victor's 2 men reached toward their jackets to grab their guns, but Marcus was faster. In a blink, he had his weapon out and aimed straight at the nearest man's head. Marcus spoke in a voice cold as steel, telling them not to be stupid. "Pull it out and you're dead." The 2 men froze, hands raised high, faces drained of color. Victor looked back at Daniel, and this time he looked carefully. At the gray eyes, at the sharp angles of his face, at the way the man stood with the absolute confidence of someone who held life and death in his hands. A vague memory stabbed at his mind. A street kid 16 years ago. Gray eyes that had looked at him with a coldness no child should have possessed. He stammered, asking who he was. Daniel took a single step forward, just one, but Victor stumbled back 3 steps as if shoved by an invisible force. Daniel spoke in a voice deep as thunder, asking whether he didn't remember him. Mr. Malone, whether he didn't remember the street kid he had reported to the police to be taken away, whether he didn't remember the child he had called a stray dog and said the woman was feeding trash. Victor felt the blood rush to his head and then drain into his legs. He remembered now. He remembered that child, the one with gray eyes that had seemed to carve his face into memory. He whispered, his voice shaking, that it couldn't be. That you're that kid." Daniel smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a wolf staring at the sheep it had hunted for 16 years, now finally caught. He said, "That's right, I'm that kid. But now people call me Roman Castellano." When the name Roman Castellano was spoken, Victor Malone felt as if all the blood had been drained from his body. That name was a nightmare in the Chicago underworld, a name no one dared speak aloud, the name of the most dangerous mafia boss in the city, a man rumored to leave no living witnesses who saw his face. And now that man was standing in front of him, and he was the child Victor had destroyed 16 years earlier. Victor collapsed to his knees, not because anyone pushed him down, but because his legs could no longer support his weight. And for the first time in his life, Victor Malone understood what true fear felt like. Roman signaled for Marcus to take Victor and his 2 men out of sight. He didn't want Mrs. Clara to witness what would happen to them afterward. Marcus nodded and led them away behind a delivery truck parked at the end of the street, leaving Roman and Mrs. Clara alone beside the old cart. Mrs. Clara was still trembling, not from the cold, but from the flood of emotions that had crashed over her in such a short span of time. Roman gently guided her to sit down on the plastic chair beside the cart, the very chair he had sat on 16 years earlier when he ate his first hot dog from her hands. He sat beside her, moving carefully as if afraid of startling her, and began to tell his story. He said that after he was taken away, he spent 3 years in a detention facility, where he was beaten and starved until he learned how to fight back, learned how to survive with his fists and with cruelty. He said that when he left the facility at 18, he was no longer Daniel. He had become someone else, someone who no longer believed in the goodness of the world with one single exception, her. He told her he had changed his name, clawed his way up from the very bottom with intelligence and ruthlessness, and built an underground empire whose true master no one ever saw. And through all those 16 years, he had never stopped watching her from a distance. Roman said he knew everything. He knew Victor came to collect money from her every month. He knew her apartment had nearly been seized twice over unpaid rent. He knew her cart had almost lost its permit 3 times because of health inspectors Victor had bribed. And every single time, he intervened from the shadows. He paid her debts without letting her know. He bought off the inspectors so they wouldn't touch her cart. He threatened creditors so they would give her more time. Mrs. Clara listened with wide eyes. She hadn't known. She had never known that all those years she believed she was standing alone against the world. Someone had been behind her, shielding her. She asked him through tears why he hadn't come back to her sooner, why he had made her wait so long. Roman was silent for a moment, then said it was because he didn't want to pull her into his world. His world was an underworld filled with enemies and danger, and if anyone knew he cared about someone, they would use that person to destroy him. He said he had to wait until he was strong enough, powerful enough, that no one would dare touch her even if they knew who she was to him. Then Roman spoke of what Mrs. Clara had been waiting 20 years to hear. He said he had uncovered the truth about Thomas's death. Mrs. Clara gripped his hand so tightly her knuckles turned white, and he continued. He explained that Victor wasn't just a petty extortionist. He was a pawn in a much larger game, paid to supply information about Thomas to people who wanted him dead. Thomas had uncovered a corruption ring within the police department, one that involved people with immense power, and they decided to silence him permanently. Victor was the link who provided details about Thomas's schedule, the route he took to work each day, the moments when he was alone, and the accident had been staged so perfectly that no one could ever prove it was murder. Mrs. Clara cried, the tears spilling freely and uncontrollably. But these weren't the tears of despair she had shed for so many years. These were tears of release. For 20 years, she had known Thomas didn't die by accident. For 20 years, she had tried to tell people, but no one believed her. They said grief had twisted her mind. They told her to accept reality and move on. But now, finally, someone believed her. Someone not only believed her, but had proof, and the power to demand justice. She held Roman's hand and thanked him. Thanked him for believing her. Thanked him for not letting Thomas die in vain. Roman tightened his grip, his hands rough from years of violence holding her hands worn by years of labor, and he promised they would pay. All of them. Victor and everyone standing behind him. He wouldn't let a single one escape. Mrs. Clara looked into Roman's storm, gray eyes filled with resolve, and for the first time in 20 years, she felt she was no longer alone. Mrs. Clara wiped her tears with the corner of her apron and looked at Roman with eyes filled with both gratitude and worry. She asked him what he intended to do with Victor, asked whether he planned to kill him. Roman studied her for a long moment before answering. He knew exactly what kind of woman she was. She was the woman who had fed him when he was starving without asking for anything in return. She was someone who believed in kindness and justice, not violence and revenge. He told her that killing Victor would be far too easy and far too quick. One bullet to the head and it would all be over in less than a second. Victor wouldn't even understand what was happening. He wouldn't feel the fear Mrs. Clara had endured for 20 years. Roman wanted Victor to lose everything before he lost his life. He wanted him to watch the small empire he had built collapse piece by piece. He wanted him to feel that same helplessness, the knowledge that there was nothing he could do to stop the destruction closing in on him. Roman explained his plan to her. First would be money. He would cut off every source of Victor's income, buy up the debts Victor controlled, pay off the borrowers so they no longer needed him, and dismantle his loan shark operation within weeks. Then would come reputation. Roman would leak evidence of Victor's crimes online and to investigative journalists, including proof of his involvement in the killing of Thomas Bennett, an honest police officer murdered for daring to stand up to corruption. Finally would come the law. Roman had people inside the federal agencies, people untouched by the corruption ring Thomas had tried to expose. They would arrest Victor and those above him using evidence that couldn't be denied. Mrs. Clara listened and felt herself torn apart inside. Part of her wanted Victor to pay for everything he had done, for Thomas, for her, for Daniel, for all the people he had hurt over the years. But another part of her didn't want blood spilled. She didn't want to become part of the cycle of violence she had hated her entire life. She told Roman that she wanted justice for Thomas. She wanted Victor to pay, but she didn't want her son to become a killer because of her. She didn't want him to carry any more guilt on his shoulders. Roman looked at her with an expression she couldn't read and said that Grandma C. He had been a killer for a long time already. That was the price he had paid to climb to the top of that world. But he promised her that with Victor, she would have both, the lawful justice she deserved and the justice of the world he lived in. He explained that Victor would be arrested, would stand trial, would be convicted for the crimes he had committed, and the world would know the truth about the death of Thomas Bennett. That was lawful justice. As for what would happen to Victor in prison afterward, Roman smiled coldly and said that the underworld had a very long memory and long arms everywhere, even behind bars. Mrs. Clara understood what he meant and didn't ask more. There were things she didn't need to know, decisions she didn't need to carry. She only nodded and said she trusted him, trusted that he would do the right thing. Roman stood up and looked toward the Maybach waiting in the shadows. He said that from now on she wouldn't stay in the old apartment anymore. He would take her somewhere safe while the plan unfolded, somewhere no one could find her or hurt her. Mrs. Clara wanted to protest, wanted to say she didn't want to leave the apartment that still held memories of Thomas and James. But she looked into Roman's eyes and understood this wasn't a suggestion. It was an order, the order of a son protecting his mother at any cost. 2 weeks later, Victor Malone's world began to collapse like a sandcastle before a tidal wave. First came the money. The debtors he had strangled for years suddenly paid everything off overnight and no longer needed him. His underground business partners abruptly cut all contact, as if he carried a contagious disease. The steady monthly income streams vanished without leaving a trace. Victor tried to find out what was happening, but no one would tell him anything. They only looked at him with fear in their eyes, shook their heads, and walked away, as if speaking to him alone would put them in danger. Then came his reputation. One morning, he woke up to see his name flooding social media. Investigative articles with bold headlines exposing Victor Malone, the loan shark king who had exploited the South Side for 26 years, accompanied by a long list of victims, evidence of threats and extortion. And most horrifying of all, a detailed dossier outlining his role in the murder of police officer Thomas Bennett. Victor read the articles with trembling hands. He couldn't understand who had obtained this information, who had dug so deeply into his past and dragged out secrets he believed had been buried forever. His phone began ringing nonstop. Former allies now called to curse him for dragging them into trouble. People who once feared him now called to threaten that they would tell the police everything if he didn't disappear. The corrupt police network he had relied on fell suddenly silent. Detective Morrison didn't answer his calls. Officers who had taken his money now denied ever knowing him. Victor understood then that he was being isolated, pushed aside like a pawn that had lost its usefulness. The people who once stood behind him were preparing to sacrifice him to save themselves. In his panic, Victor thought of Mrs. Clara, the old hot dog vendor he had extorted for 26 years. He thought she might know something, might somehow be connected to the nightmare closing in on him, and if things grew worse, he could always take her hostage. He staggered toward the familiar street corner, sweat pouring down his face, but when he arrived, Mrs. Clara's cart was gone. The corner stood empty, as if no one had ever sold anything there. No sizzling hot dogs, no patched awning, no old woman with calloused hands. Victor stood in the empty street, his head spinning, unable to understand where she had gone or why she had vanished at this exact moment. Then he heard the sound of an engine. When he turned around, the black Maybach was already parked behind him, silent and gleaming. The door opened, and Roman Castellano stepped out, dressed in a flawless black suit, an expensive watch catching the light, storm-gray eyes watching Victor with the quiet pleasure of a predator studying exhausted prey. Marcus Stone stood beside the car, arms crossed, ready for anything. Victor stumbled backward. He had heard enough about Roman Castellano in the underworld to know that encountering this man usually meant death, yet he couldn't understand why a mafia boss would appear here, why he would care about an old hot dog vendor and a small-time loan shark like him. Roman walked closer, each step slow and deliberate, and asked in a voice deep as thunder who he was looking for here. Victor. Victor stammered that he meant no offense, that he didn't know why Roman was here, that he begged for his life. Roman smiled faintly and asked whether he truly didn't remember him, whether he didn't remember the 12-year-old child he had called a stray dog 16 years ago, whether he didn't remember reporting that child to the police and having him taken away from the only woman who had ever loved him. Victor stared into those gray eyes, into that sharp face, and memory crashed over him like a wave. The street child, the cold gaze from behind the cart, the way the boy had watched and remembered everything, as if writing a ledger of debts. He whispered in terror that you're that kid, you're Daniel. Roman smiled, cold as ice and sharp as a blade, and said he had waited 16 years to hear Victor say those words, and now Victor would pay for everything he had done. For Grandma C, for Thomas Bennett, and for every person he had destroyed in his rotten life. Victor collapsed to his knees, tears and mucus running down his face as he begged, saying he had only followed orders, that he hadn't made the decisions, that he would confess everything if spared. Roman looked down at the man who had forced Mrs. Clara to live in fear for 20 years. The man who had helped kill Thomas Bennett, the man who had broken a 12-year-old boy long ago, and said that Victor would have his chance to confess everything to the federal authorities, in an open trial, in front of the entire world. 3 days after the confrontation at the street corner, justice finally came for those who had escaped it for far too long. That morning, federal agents carried out simultaneous raids on the homes of Victor Malone and Detective Frank Morrison. They kicked in the doors at 5 o'clock in the morning while both men were still asleep, handcuffed them, and read them their Miranda rights in front of families and neighbors who stood watching in stunned silence. The news spread across Chicago like wildfire. Television screens in every cafe and on every street corner showed Victor Malone being led out of his house, his face drained of color and his eyes hollow, followed by Detective Morrison, whose expression had completely collapsed. News channels ran non-stop coverage of what they called the largest arrest in the history of the Chicago Police Department, exposing a corruption ring that had lasted nearly 30 years, and revealing the murder of the honest police officer Thomas Bennett, a crime that had long been hidden beneath the disguise of a traffic accident. Evidence was released to the public, recorded phone calls between Victor and Morrison discussing how to deal with Thomas, bank records showing streams of money flowing from criminal organizations into the accounts of corrupt officers, testimonies from witnesses who had once been too afraid to speak because they feared being killed. The federal prosecutor held a press conference and declared that this was a dark day for those who believed they stood above the law, and that Thomas Bennett would finally be cleared of all suspicion after 20 years of pain and injustice suffered by his family. Mrs. Clara stood inside Roman's penthouse, looking down at the city of Chicago through the wide glass windows while watching everything unfold on the flat-screen television. She didn't cry. She had cried enough over the past 20 years. Now she only felt a wave of relief spread through her body, as if someone had finally lifted the enormous weight she had carried on her shoulders for so long. Thomas was finally recognized as a hero, not a victim of a tragic accident, but an honest police officer who had sacrificed his life for daring to stand up against evil. His name was spoken with respect on every news channel. No longer an unlucky husband, but a brave one. No longer an absent father, but a father who died protecting what he believed in. Roman stood beside Mrs. Clara without saying a word, simply placing a hand on her shoulder in silent comfort. She turned to look at him with eyes still red but empty of tears and said, "Thank you. Thomas can finally rest now." Roman nodded and replied that this was what she should have received 20 years ago, and he only wished he could have done it sooner. Mrs. Clara shook her head and said it was all right. He had done it now. What mattered was that the truth had been exposed. The guilty would pay the price, and Thomas would no longer be remembered as the victim of an accident. They stood together in silence for a long while, looking down at the busy city below, watching police cars pass with flashing lights, watching life continue as if nothing had happened. Then Mrs. Clara asked Roman what would happen to Victor in prison. Roman looked at her for a moment, then smiled the same cold smile she had seen when he faced Victor, and replied that the underworld doesn't forget, and there are people behind bars who owe him many favors. Mrs. Clara understood what he meant and didn't ask anything more. There were things she didn't need to know, kinds of justice the law couldn't carry out, but Roman's world could. She simply nodded and turned back toward the window, where the sun was rising higher and light was flooding the city, like a new day beginning, after 20 years of darkness. 1 week after Victor and Morrison were arrested, when everything had begun to settle and Mrs. Clara was slowly adjusting to her new life inside Roman's secure penthouse. He called her into the living room with an unusually serious expression. Mrs. Clara sat down on the soft leather sofa and looked at Roman with worried eyes, asking if something was wrong and why he looked so grave. Roman sat across from her and stayed silent for a moment, as if weighing where to begin. Then he said softly that Grandma C. There was something he had to tell her, something he had kept to himself for 3 years, and now it was time for her to know. Mrs. Clara felt her heart start to race. She didn't know what was coming, but the way Roman spoke told her this was important, something that could be good or bad, but would certainly change something forever. Roman took a deep breath and said that he had found James, her son. Mrs. Clara felt as if a hammer had slammed into her chest. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, her eyes widening until it almost hurt. James, the name she had called out in her dreams for 18 years since the day he left. The name she was afraid to say aloud because the pain might swallow her whole. She stammered and asked if James, her son, was still alive, and where he was. Roman nodded and began to tell her the story he had kept hidden for 3 years. He said that when he began building his empire and finally had the resources to search, the first thing he did was look for Mrs. Clara and everyone connected to her. He found James 3 years ago, living on the streets of Los Angeles, heavily addicted to heroin and almost completely out of hope. Mrs. Clara covered her mouth and cried as she heard this, imagining her son, the boy who once grinned beside a birthday cake in the framed photo on her wall, now lying in some alley with a needle in his arm. Roman went on to say that he had James taken to a high-end rehabilitation center outside Chicago, the best money could buy, and that he had quietly paid for all of James's treatment over the past 3 years without ever letting him know who was helping him. He explained that he hadn't told her sooner because he didn't want to give her hope only to disappoint her, because recovery is long and painful, and many people fail and relapse again and again before they succeed, and he wanted to wait until James was truly clean and stable before telling her. Mrs. Clara cried without a sound, tears pouring down her face like a river. She didn't know whether she was crying from heartbreak over what her son had endured, from joy at knowing he was alive and being healed, or from gratitude toward Roman for doing all of this without asking for anything in return. She asked in a trembling voice how James was now, whether he was well, whether he knew she was still alive and still waiting for him. Roman smiled, a rare warm smile he showed only to her, and replied that James had been clean for 2 years now and was working at the rehabilitation center as a counselor, helping others through the same hell he had survived. He added that James knew about her, knew she was alive and had kept selling hot dogs at the old street corner, but he was too ashamed to come back and face her. He believed he had disappointed her too many times, that he had left when she needed him most, and that he didn't deserve her forgiveness. Mrs. Clara shook her head fiercely and said no. There was nothing to forgive. James was her son. She had loved him from the day he was born, and would love him until the day she closed her eyes, and no matter what he had done, he was still her child. She took Roman's hand and begged him with her eyes to take her to see James, saying she wanted to see her son, that she had waited 18 years and didn't want to wait another single day. Roman nodded and said he would take her tomorrow, that James was ready to see her, and had been waiting for this moment just as much as she had. Mrs. Clara hugged Roman and cried against his shoulder, whispering, "Thank you for bringing Thomas back. Thank you for finding James. Thank you for not forgetting her even though she was nobody." Roman held her, the strong hands that had taken lives without hesitation now gently patting her back the way a son comforts his mother, and he said she was everything to him, the first and only person who ever showed him what it meant to be loved, and that he would spend his whole life repaying her even though he knew he never truly could. Mrs. Clara pulled back and looked into Roman's gray eyes, eyes that had once been cold as ice and now shimmered with something she hadn't seen when they first reunited, and she said with a trembling voice that he was her son, Daniel, her son not by blood but by love, and that she was proud of him, proud of the man he had become even though life had treated him with such cruelty. Roman didn't speak. He simply nodded and held her once more. And in that moment, the most dangerous mafia boss in Chicago was nothing more than a son finding his way back into his mother's arms. The next morning, The Maybach drove Mrs. Clara to a quiet area on the outskirts of Chicago, where a rehabilitation center sat among rows of lush green trees and neatly trimmed lawns. Mrs. Clara sat in the car with her heart racing, her hands gripping her handbag as if she were trying to keep herself from drifting away. 18 years. 18 years without seeing her son's face. 18 years of wondering where he was, whether he was alive or dead, whether he was happy or suffering. And now, just a few dozen meters away, was the door that held the answers to every night she had cried alone. Roman sat beside her, took her hand, and asked if she was ready. Mrs. Clara nodded, even though she wasn't sure she truly was, then stepped out of the car on trembling legs. Roman guided her through the gate, past the reception area, down a long hallway lined with landscape paintings, until they stopped in front of a wooden door. Roman knocked, and a voice came from inside, a voice Mrs. Clara hadn't heard in nearly 2 decades, but recognized instantly, her son's voice. The door opened and James stood there, taller than the last time she had seen him, thinner, older, with lines etched into his forehead and strands of premature gray at his temples. But his eyes were still Thomas's eyes, warm and deep, and when they fell on her, they filled with tears. James froze for a second as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing, then rushed forward and collapsed to his knees at Mrs. Clara's feet, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. He choked out apologies, saying he was sorry for leaving, sorry for not being there when she needed him most, sorry for disappointing her, saying he was the worst son in the world and didn't deserve her forgiveness. Mrs. Clara cried, her tears falling onto her son's graying hair, and she knelt down with him, cradling his face in her wrinkled hands and forcing him to look at her. She told him to look at her, to look into her eyes, that he was her son, her flesh and blood, that she had loved him from the day he was born and would love him until the day she died, that there was nothing to forgive because he had never done anything wrong to her, that he was just a child broken by the loss of his father, and that she hadn't been strong enough to hold him, that if anyone needed to apologize it was her, not him. James cried like a child, clinging to his mother and sobbing into her shoulder, as if releasing all the loneliness and pain of the years he had lost. Mrs. Clara held him and patted his back the way she used to when he was small, when he cried after falling off his bike or being bullied by other kids. The two of them wept together in the small room, while Roman stood quietly at the doorway, watching with eyes that glistened despite his effort to hide it. After a long while, when the tears had eased and their breathing had steadied, Mrs. Clara stood up and helped James to his feet. She turned to Roman and told James that she wanted to introduce him to someone who had saved her, uncovered the truth about his father's death, found him, and quietly supported him for 3 years, without asking for anything in return. James looked at Roman with curiosity and gratitude, and Mrs. Clara continued, saying his name was Daniel, though he could call him Roman, and that he was her son, not by blood but by love. Just as James was her son by blood and by love. James looked at Roman, then back at his mother, and he understood. He stepped forward and held out his hand, thanking Roman for taking care of his mother when he couldn't, for giving him a second chance, saying he didn't know what else to say except thank you. Roman shook James's hand and replied that there was no need to thank him, that she had saved him when he had no one, and this was the least he could do. Then Mrs. Clara pulled both of her sons into her arms, holding the 2 men life had nearly taken from her forever. The 3 of them stood there, a strange family formed from loss and pain, from kindness and endurance, and Mrs. Clara knew that even though Thomas was gone, he would be smiling if he could see this, because the Bennett family had finally been reunited in a way no one could have imagined. A few months had passed since the reunion at the rehabilitation center, and Mrs. Clara's life had changed in ways she had never dared to dream of. The old apartment on the 3rd floor of the crumbling building had now been completely renovated, not turned into something flashy or extravagant, but into a true home, with freshly painted walls, newly laid wooden floors, a heating system that worked properly, and windows that no longer rattled whenever the wind blew. Roman had wanted to buy her a luxurious penthouse or a quiet house in the suburbs, but Mrs. Clara refused. She said this was the place where she had lived with Thomas, where she had raised James, where the memories she couldn't bear to leave behind still lived. Roman understood and respected her decision. He only made sure the apartment was repaired so she could live comfortably and safely, with a modern security system, so she no longer had to worry about any threats. Mrs. Clara's food cart was still on the old street corner, the same corner where she had met Daniel 16 years earlier, but it had been completely upgraded. A new cart with modern cooking equipment, a sturdy canopy that no longer needed patching, and all the proper business permits so no one could harass her again. Roman even hired someone to design a small, lovely sign that read Clara's kitchen. But Clara asked for it to be changed to Bennett's kitchen in memory of Thomas, and Roman agreed without a word of protest. James left the rehabilitation center and came home to live with his mother. He slept in the small room where he had grown up, now freshly painted and furnished with a more comfortable bed, yet still keeping the old desk in its original place, where he had once done his homework as a child. James didn't sit around doing nothing. He worked for a charity founded by Roman called the Thomas Bennett Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping street children and people battling addiction. He used his painful experiences to help others, and each day he woke up with a clear sense of purpose instead of the emptiness he had carried for so many years. Every week, the familiar black Maybach would pull up at the corner, and Roman would step out, no longer with the distant coldness of a mafia boss, but with the warm smile of a son coming to visit his mother. He would sit on the plastic chair beside the cart, eat the hot dogs Mrs. Clara made, and talk with her about everything except his work in the underworld. Sometimes James would join them, and the three of them would sit together, eating and laughing like a normal family, as if there hadn't been 18 years of loss and suffering between them. Helen still lived in the apartment across the hall, and often came over to visit Mrs. Clara. She still couldn't believe the transformation in her friend's life, and often said that God had finally looked down and blessed Mrs. Clara after so many years of endurance. News about Victor Malone came one autumn morning. As Mrs. Clara was preparing to open her cart, he had been found dead in his cell at the federal prison. The official cause was a stroke, though there were rumors he had been beaten by other inmates before he died. Mrs. Clara heard the news and felt no joy or satisfaction. She only felt a final sense of relief, as if the last chapter of a painful book had finally been closed. She didn't ask Roman about it, and Roman didn't mention it. There were things that didn't need to be spoken because they both understood. Detective Morrison was sentenced to 30 years in prison for his role in the murder of a police officer and for corruption, and those who stood behind him were gradually exposed and punished as well. Thomas Bennett was posthumously honored as a hero, and his name was given to a small street near the South Side, where he had lived and fought for justice. Mrs. Clara attended the street naming ceremony with James and Roman standing beside her, and as she looked at the sign bearing her husband's name, she whispered that, "Do you see that, Thomas? Justice has finally come. At last you are remembered for who you truly were." One afternoon, like so many others on the south side of Chicago, smoke drifted slowly up from the grill, blending with the rich scent of sizzling hot dogs and freshly toasted bread. Mrs. Clara stood behind the cart called Bennett's Kitchen, her hands still moving with the same practiced rhythm they had for years. Yet something had changed. The smile on her face was now a real one, no longer forced or weary, no longer hiding pain or loneliness, but the smile of someone who had found again everything she once believed was lost forever. The sound of a car engine reached her ears, and Mrs. Clara looked up as the familiar black Maybach pulled up at the corner. Roman stepped out wearing an expensive charcoal gray suit, but as he approached the cart, the cold presence of a mafia boss faded away, leaving only the warm eyes of a son coming home to his mother. He sat down on the old plastic chair just as he had 16 years earlier, like the hungry 12-year-old boy he once was, and said, "Give me a full portion, Mrs. E." Mrs. Clara smiled and began to prepare it. And at that moment James appeared from the corner of the street, walking briskly with a smile on his face. Holding a small bouquet of flowers he had bought for his mother on the way, James sat down beside Roman, and the two men nodded to each other like true brothers. Mrs. Clara looked at her two sons, one she had given birth to by blood and one she had taken in by love, and she felt her heart fill so completely it almost felt like it might burst. She thought back on everything that had happened, from the fateful afternoon when she fed a homeless boy, through the long years of pain and waiting, to the day justice was finally done and her family was made whole again. And she understood a truth she would carry with her for the rest of her life. That sometimes a simple meal does more than fill an empty stomach. It can guide lost hearts back home. It can plant a tiny seed that years later grows into a garden of love and redemption. She placed 2 hot dog plates in front of Roman and James, then sat down with them, the 3 of them eating amid laughter and easy conversation, like a normal family on an ordinary afternoon, and that was the most extraordinary gift life could offer. The story of Mrs. Clara, of Daniel, and of James stands as proof of the power of kindness and patience. No matter how cruel life may be, no matter how deep the darkness grows, a single small act of compassion can light a flame of hope and change many destinies. The lesson we can take from this story is to never underestimate the power of a kind act, to never give up hope, no matter how long the wait, and to never forget that family is defined not only by blood but by love and sacrifice. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss meaningful stories each day. Like and share this video with the people you love to help spread the message of kindness and perseverance. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel, whether it reminded you of someone in your own life or made you think about acts of kindness you have received or given. Please leave a comment below to share what's in your heart. We read every word and value every thought. Wishing all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Thank you for watching. Goodbye for now, and we hope to see you again in the next video.